In the summer of 1942, Stalingrad was alive. The river glistened in the sunlight, trams rattled through crowded streets, and children played barefoot near the factory walls. Men worked 12-hour shifts in the steel plants, their faces black with soot, but their hearts proud. This was the city that carried the name of the leader himself. The war was far away, or at least, that's what they told themselves. Radio broadcasts spoke of victories in the West. Posters promised that the Red Army would stop the enemy long before he reached the Volga. People believed it because believing was easier than imagining the alternative. Every morning, the city woke to the same sounds: whistles from the factories, footsteps of workers on the cobblestone, the hum of machines and life itself. In the evenings, the smell of baked bread drifted from the bakeries, and soldiers on leave sat on benches near the river, talking quietly, smoking cheap cigarettes. They didn't know they were standing on the edge of history and of hell. By August, rumors spread like smoke. German tanks were advancing across the steppe, cutting through villages and fields, but in Stalingrad, the air still felt safe. The newspapers printed brave headlines. "The enemy will be destroyed before he reaches the Volga." Mothers tucked their children into bed. Workers sang patriotic songs. Students volunteered for defense training, half excited, half afraid. Then, one morning, the factory sirens screamed, but not for a shift change. They screamed for war. At first, people didn't understand what they were hearing. A low, distant hum rolled over the city, like thunder but steady, growing louder by the second. Eyes turned upward. Dots appeared in the sky. Dozens, then hundreds. The sun glinted off metal wings. Someone shouted, "It's ours!" But the planes came from the west, and then the sirens wailed again, this time too late. The first explosion struck the train station, then the oil tanks, then the heart of the city. Windows shattered for miles, the air filled with dust and flame. Fire rolled through the streets like water, unstoppable, alive. Children screamed for their mothers. Men ran toward the factories to save what they could. One woman fell to her knees and covered her son with her body as debris rained down. A soldier later wrote, "The city was still breathing, but it was already burning." By nightfall, the skyline of Stalingrad glowed red. The river reflected the fire like molten steel. From the other side of the Volga, people could see the flames rising into the clouds. Stalingrad had become a target, and within hours it would become a symbol. The calm was gone. The storm had begun. The bombing did not stop with sunset. When darkness came, the sky glowed orange, a false dawn born of destruction. Flames rolled across the rooftops, eating through timber and brick, leaping from one street to another as if the entire city were made of oil. The heat was unbearable. People ran through the streets clutching children, coats, and whatever they could carry. The smoke turned day into night, and night into something worse, a choking void filled with screams. The air itself seemed to burn. Ash fell like snow. You could taste iron and fear in every breath. The city was not burning, a survivor wrote. It was melting. Down by the Volga, chaos became horror. Oil tanks along the riverbank exploded, spilling burning fuel into the water. The great river, the pride of the Soviet Union, turned black and red, a mirror of hell itself. Boats loaded with refugees tried to cross to the eastern shore, but many caught fire before reaching safety. The lucky ones rode through floating debris, past the bodies of neighbors and soldiers alike. The unlucky were swallowed by the flames. Men shouted orders no one could hear. Children cried for mothers already gone. The city's sirens had long fallen silent, drowned by the roar of destruction. Among the chaos, a few Red Army units stayed behind. Young conscripts, factory workers, students, men who had never held a rifle before. They dragged wounded civilians out of rubble, dug trenches with their bare hands, and waited for an enemy they could not yet see. Some were too shocked to fight. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We had rifles, but against the sky, what use were rifles?" The planes flew so low I could see the pilots' faces. When the bombers finally left, silence returned. But it was not peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. By morning, Stalingrad no longer existed. The streets were filled with smoking craters. Whole districts were gone, turned to gray ash and twisted metal. The air stank of oil, flesh, and burning paper. In the center of the city, the famous department store, once a symbol of modern life, stood without a roof. Beside it, a tram was frozen in the middle of the street, its passengers still sitting upright, charred to the bone. Even the soldiers were silent when they saw it. War had come, but it wasn't a battle yet. It was annihilation. Those who could still walk were herded toward the river. Boats ferried civilians to the eastern bank under constant air raids. The Volga, once a lifeline, became a crossing into uncertainty. One witness remembered, "The river was so full of smoke that the horizon disappeared. We rode through ashes, not water, but many refused to leave. Old men, women, and teenagers stayed behind saying, 'If the city burns, we burn with it.' They would become part of the defense, unwilling soldiers in the battle to come. When the sun finally rose, it revealed a city without color. Everything was gray, the buildings, the air, the people. Only the flames still moved, eating through what little remained. Stalingrad was now a graveyard, and the war hadn't even reached the streets yet. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the German Sixth Army was advancing, and those who survived the fire would soon face something even worse: the enemy himself. By September 1942, the front line wasn't outside Stalingrad. It was inside it. Every street, every building, every staircase became a front of its own. The Germans had reached the Volga, but they hadn't conquered it. They had no idea what kind of war waited for them here. Stalingrad wasn't just defending itself, it was fighting back with everything it had. Civilians, soldiers, factory workers all became part of the same army. "We didn't fight for victory," one soldier later said. "We fought for every brick." German troops entered the city expecting another quick victory. They met walls of resistance, literally. One sniper hid behind a hole in a wall, waiting for hours for a single shot. In the next building, a German machine gunner did the same. They were separated by just a few meters of shattered concrete, listening to each other breathe. By day, the streets were death traps. By night, both sides crawled through the rubble to take a building, a floor, or even a single room. A single apartment could change hands 5 times in one day. In the north, the Red October and Barakati factories turned into fortresses. Machines were moved aside, and the assembly lines were covered with sandbags. Tanks were built during the day and used to fight by night. Men and women fought side by side. A mechanic might die holding a wrench, a nurse with a pistol in her shaking hands. They lived among fire, dust, and iron, sleeping beside the machines they once used for work. The Germans called this kind of fighting Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. They weren't wrong. It was dark, close, and endless. The smell of the city changed. It was no longer smoke and oil. It was rot. The streets were filled with corpses, frozen in the ruins, buried under walls. Dogs disappeared first, then rats, then hunger came. Soldiers fought over food, over boots, over anything that could keep them alive another day. We stopped burying the dead, one man recalled. We didn't have time. We just fought around them. Above the chaos, a different kind of war was being fought, silent, invisible. Soviet snipers hid among the rubble, using every hole, every shadow. Their legend spread, and one name became known across both sides: Vasily Zaitsev. He hunted not for glory, but for survival. He said, "The best place to hide is among the dead." They no longer fear the bullets. The Germans sent their own snipers to hunt him, a duel that would become one of the most famous in history. But for every Zaitsev, there were hundreds of nameless fighters doing the same, unseen, unremembered. By November, the city was almost gone, yet it refused to die. Smoke hung over the ruins like a shroud. Both armies were exhausted, filthy, half-mad. They fought in basements, in sewers, in bombed-out stairwells. The line between soldier and civilian disappeared. Men and women were united not by uniform, but by survival. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Stalingrad is no longer a city. It's a volcano full of madmen." He was right. And the volcano was still erupting. At night, fires glowed like veins through the ruins. Somewhere, a piano still stood in the rubble. A soldier pressed a few broken keys before a shell ended the melody. The people of Stalingrad didn't see beauty, but they saw purpose. They were defending the last breath of their city, a city that, even in death, refused to stop breathing. Stalingrad had stopped being a city. It was a maze of ruins, smoke, and silence, except for the sound of distant gunfire echoing between hollow buildings. There was no running water, no electricity, no warmth. And yet, somehow, people were still alive. In basements and half-collapsed houses, families huddled together. Children whispered songs their parents taught them before the bombs fell. Mothers boiled water over fires made from broken furniture. It wasn't enough to live. It was just enough not to die. "We were underground like moles," one woman recalled. "The earth was our roof, and the sound of bombs was our lullaby." There were children everywhere, dirty, silent, eyes older than their faces. Some helped carry ammunition, others filled sandbags, some just sat in corners holding dolls made from rags. A Red Army soldier once found a boy no older than 12 carrying a bucket of snow. When he asked what he was doing, the boy said, "It's for my mother. She's thirsty." The soldier followed him and found his mother dead. He didn't take the bucket away. He just helped the boy carry it. Food was more precious than bullets. Every loaf of bread was cut into tiny squares and shared among soldiers and civilians. Some mixed flour with sawdust to make it last longer. Others chewed leather belts when there was nothing else. The city's cats and dogs had long disappeared, and everyone knew what that meant. A Soviet nurse wrote, "Hunger changes people. Some cry, some pray, some laugh for no reason. But everyone keeps moving, because stopping means dying." Thousands of women fought and worked in Stalingrad, not only as nurses, but as snipers, radio operators, and factory workers. They repaired tanks in the ruins, cleaned rifles, and carried the wounded through shell fire. One of them, Yelena, wrote to her sister, "We used to make toys in this factory. Now we make grenades." Maybe both saved lives in their own way. Some women never left their posts. They froze in the same position they worked, tools still in hand. The Volga was both salvation and death. Supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements came across it under constant German fire. In the winter, it froze solid, and men crossed it on foot through blizzards, dragging sleds with the wounded. Every crossing meant risking everything. But without the river, the city would have starved completely. A ferryman recalled, "The ice was red from blood. It cracked beneath us, but we didn't stop. Behind us, nothing. Ahead, Stalingrad. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the death, something strange began to grow inside the survivors. Not fear, but defiance. They started to believe that if they endured this, nothing could ever break them again. Soldiers carried letters from civilians in their pockets, reading them before every fight. One read, "We are still here. The city still stands. Do not let it fall." That note was found later in a soldier's coat riddled with holes. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, the firing stopped, and in that silence someone would begin to sing, softly, almost afraid. A lullaby, an old folk song, something that reminded them of the world before. For a few minutes, the ruins became human again, and then the bombs would start falling, and the song would end, unfinished, like everything else in Stalingrad. "We didn't fight for Stalin," said one survivor years later. "We fought for each other, for the ones who still breathe beside us." In the rubble, surrounded by death, the people of Stalingrad learned what it truly meant to be alive. By November 1942, the city was nothing but ruins and smoke, but it still stood. The Germans controlled most of it, yet could not finish the job. They were exhausted, hungry, freezing. Their commanders promised that victory was just one more push away. But the Red Army was no longer retreating. It was circling. Across the frozen steppe, Soviet divisions closed in from the north and south. Like a slow, merciless tide, they moved to cut off the enemy's escape. The Germans didn't see it coming until it was too late. On November 19th, Operation Uranus began. Artillery thundered for hours, shaking the snow off distant roofs. When the smoke cleared, the hunters had become the hunted. Within days, two great Soviet armies met near the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The ring was closed. Inside it, 300,000 German soldiers, along with Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, and a handful of civilians who never managed to flee. Radio messages from German command screamed, "Hold your positions. Relief will come." But the truth was clear. No one was coming. The Sixth Army was trapped in a wasteland of ice and ruins, surrounded by an enemy that had learned to fight like ghosts. Then came the real enemy, the Russian winter. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, weapons jammed, boots stiffened into ice. Men wrapped themselves in curtains, newspapers, and rags torn from dead comrades. The wounded froze in their beds before dawn. One German doctor wrote, "We stopped using morphine. It was frozen solid. We broke it with knives. Horses died by the hundreds. Their meat became rations. Then even the horses were gone." The soldiers began boiling leather belts and pages of books. Some chewed on frozen bread until their teeth cracked. Despite everything, letters still left Stalingrad, carried by planes, coded messages, desperate scribbles on scraps of paper. They were filled with the same words: cold, hunger, fear. One soldier wrote to his wife, "Don't expect me back. We are surrounded. The snow covers everything now." Even hope another wrote, We used to fear the Russians. Now we fear the knights. The ink froze before he could finish. The once proud German army began to fall apart. Commanders ordered them to hold, but men stopped listening. They stole food from each other, burned anything that would burn, and prayed for snow to stop falling. An officer described it bluntly. We are no longer soldiers. We are animals waiting to die. The Red Army's loudspeakers played music through the cold air, waltzes, Russian songs, even messages promising mercy for those who surrendered. Most Germans listened in silence. A few cried. Back in the ruins of Stalingrad, the cold spared no one, not even the victors. Soviet soldiers wrapped rags around their faces to keep them from freezing. They fought in snow trenches, using the dead as cover from wind. One wrote, "The ground is so hard, we cannot dig graves. The dead stay with us." And still, the fighting went on. Bullet by bullet, breath by breath. By December, the trapped army was starving. Every plane that tried to bring supplies was shot down. Each package that fell from the sky landed in the snow like a mockery. Too little, too late. The German commander, Paulus, begged for permission to retreat. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be taken. But Stalingrad wasn't a city anymore. It was a grave, and soon it would claim them all. January 1943. The snow no longer looked white. It was gray, soaked with ash, blood, and oil. The city was silent except for distant gunfire and the occasional explosion that echoed like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Inside the ruins, the German Sixth Army had stopped being an army. They were thousands of shadows in torn coats, sleeping beside frozen corpses. Many could no longer tell the living from the dead. "We didn't fight anymore," one survivor wrote. "We just tried not to fall." The last order from Berlin was simple: hold Stalingrad to the last man. But the last man had already died. Soldiers too weak to walk crawled between ruins. Officers tore off their medals to melt them for water. The horses were gone. The food was gone. The hope was gone. A young lieutenant tried to rally his men one final time. He shouted, "For the Führer," and no one replied. They just stared at him, blank-eyed. Holding rifles, they no longer had the strength to fire. The Soviets advanced methodically, building by building, floor by floor. They didn't storm. They pressed in, slowly, relentlessly. There was nothing left to conquer, only to finish. A Soviet commander later said, "We didn't need to attack." The enemy was already dying. In one bombed-out basement, 20 Germans surrendered to a single Soviet soldier. They offered their last cigarettes, their watches, even their bread. He took nothing. He just pointed to the exit and said, "Go." There was no hatred left, only exhaustion. At the center of the city, in the basement of a destroyed department store, General Friedrich Paulus sat at a table surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. He had been promoted to field marshal that morning. A final insult. No German field marshal had ever surrendered before. Hitler expected him to shoot himself. Instead, he dropped the phone and whispered, "The war is lost." At 7:45 a.m., January 31, 1943, the commander of the Sixth Army surrendered. By February 2nd, the last German resistance in Stalingrad was gone. When the Red Army entered the final pockets, they found silence. Tens of thousands of bodies lay frozen in the snow. Others sat upright in the ruins, hands still gripping rifles, eyes glazed over. The survivors, barely 90,000 of them, stumbled out with raised hands. Their faces were hollow, their uniforms rags. Many collapsed before reaching the assembly lines. One Soviet medic wrote, "We tried to help them, but they were beyond help. They looked at us and smiled, like people who were already dead." When Moscow announced the victory, the city cheered. But in Stalingrad, there was no cheering. There was only silence and snow. Soviet soldiers walked through the ruins without speaking. Some sat down beside their fallen comrades and cried. Others just stared into the horizon, unsure what they had won, only that they had survived. "Victory smelled like smoke," one wrote, "and it sounded like nothing." By the time the guns fell silent, more than 1 million people, soldiers and civilians, were gone. The city was rubble, the river frozen, and the air still heavy with dust. But Stalingrad was still there, not alive, but not dead either. It had survived the unthinkable, and in that survival, it had already won. When the guns finally stopped, there was no sound, just the wind moving through ruins that used to be streets. The smoke hung low, curling between broken walls and twisted steel. The Volga was frozen solid, its surface littered with debris and the black shapes of boats that never made it across. Stalingrad was a graveyard, but under the ashes, something still breathed. Those who remained crawled out from basements and trenches, eyes blinking against the gray light. They were thin, ragged, covered in soot and frostbite. Many could no longer speak. A Soviet nurse remembered, "When we came out, the silence was louder than the bombs. There were no voices, no birds, only the wind and the smell of smoke." Among the ruins, they began searching for the living. Children called for parents who would never answer. Men lifted stones with bleeding hands, hoping to find someone still breathing beneath. Some found nothing. Others found hope. The first reconstruction orders came just weeks after the battle. There were no machines left, no materials, no homes. But there were people. Men and women began clearing rubble with shovels and bare hands. They used broken bricks to build stoves. They melted snow for water. They dug holes in the ground to sleep in and called them houses. A Red Army engineer wrote, "The city was dead, but the people were alive." So they started building life again. Within months, smoke rose from chimneys again, not from destruction, but from cooking fires. By autumn, the first trams ran through the ruins, their bells echoing like ghosts returning home. The soldiers who survived didn't feel like heroes. They looked around and saw only what had been lost. Some never spoke about Stalingrad again. Others carried its memory like a scar. But in Moscow, in London, in Washington, the word Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of a war that could still be won. One foreign correspondent wrote, "The Germans came with fire. The Russians answered with endurance." It wasn't triumph that saved the city. It was stubbornness. Those who surrendered were marched through the ruins in silence. Civilians watched them pass. Thin, frost-bitten men who had once promised to conquer the world. No one threw stones. No one cheered. A Soviet woman whispered, "They look like us." For some, pity came before hatred. For others, there was nothing left to feel. Most of those prisoners would never return home. They would die in the same land they tried to destroy. But their fate, too, became part of the story. A reminder that, in war, there are no victors. Spring 1943 came slowly. Snow melted into black rivers that carried ashes away. Grass began to grow between the ruins. Children's laughter, faint, unsure, returned to the air. People planted flowers in shell craters. Women hung laundry between the remains of walls. Men played harmonicas at night beside fires that warmed both soldiers and civilians. The city that had been erased from the map was writing itself back into history. Years later, veterans would say that Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a test of the human soul. The city had been destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, and still it endured. They tried to burn it, one old woman said. But how do you burn a spirit? The ruins became monuments, the ashes became memory, and the name Stalingrad became something greater than a place. It became a promise that even in the darkest times, humanity can still stand. When night falls over the modern city, now called Volgograd, lights shimmer on the river. The wind still whistles through the ruins that remain, carrying voices from long ago. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them: workers, soldiers, mothers, children, the people who refused to die. Stalingrad was not just a city, it was a heartbeat, and it never stopped.